If you haven't noticed, it's a presidential election year, and you know what that means.
Jobs, unemployment, inflation.
Endless arguments about which president will be better for your pocketbook. But before you get sucked into that debate, it's worth asking how much influence presidents have over the economy to begin with. It's likely to be the longest presidential campaign ever because Biden and Trump locked up their nominations months ago. It's also the first time both candidates have already been president, which means they both have a track record to scrutinize and debate and pick apart, including how the US economy fared while they were in the White House. I totally get the real desire to credit your team with the economy's gains. But let's get real.
How real?
The US economy is way bigger than any president, and we Americans should act like it and have some pride in something beyond political party.
That does sound nice.
Our economy is massive, the biggest in the world by far, built by both Republicans and Democrats. It's also the best economic system in the world, designed by some really smart cookies of every political stripe. But if that doesn't persuade you, consider this. The US economy is a $28 trillion juggernaut. The private sector is responsible for 80 to 90% of it, and the president has very little influence or control over the private sector, if at all.
I didn't know that. You're telling me now for the first time.
The president isn't even the main player in the government's biggest contributions to the economy, which are Congress's fiscal policy and the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. But since this is do the math, I wanted to look at some numbers to see if they would persuade me otherwise. So I dug up real GDP growth for every administration since FDR. I decided on GDP because it's probably the most widely followed measure of the US economy. There are interesting debates about whether GDP is the best measure of the economy, but that's for another day. I'm looking at real GDP, which means GDP after inflation, so that I can compare presidents on an apples-to-apples basis over different inflationary environments. I'm starting with FDR in 1933 because the data goes back to the end of 1929, so it doesn't quite cover the entire presidency of Herbert Hoover. Hoover also had the bad luck of presiding over the beginning of the Great Depression, so it feels mean to peg him with a decline of 26% in real GDP. So with all of that as background, here's what I found. First, some interesting big picture stuff. There have been 8 Democrats and 7 Republicans in the White House since FDR, including Biden. Surprisingly, the economy grew a lot faster under Democrats than Republicans. Annual GDP after inflation averaged 4.5% under Democrats versus 2.7% under Republicans. Also, if we rank presidents by real GDP growth, the top 4 would all be Democrats: Roosevelt, Johnson, Kennedy, and Clinton, in that order. But when I look closer at the numbers, it feels like our presidents have mostly just been at the right place at the right time.
It's all timing with these things.
Or like poor Hoover, at the wrong place at the wrong time. For example, Roosevelt presided over real GDP growth of 9% a year, by far the highest of any president since then. But he also took office just as the economy hit rock bottom. So a lot of that growth was the economy bouncing back from the depths of the Great Depression. Roosevelt also happened to be president during World War II, which required a huge mobilization of resources that resulted in the highest economic growth since 1929. Second and third on the list are Johnson and Kennedy, which is no coincidence because they led the country during the booming 1960s. The economy boomed in part because of the post-war investments in infrastructure during the 1950s, including the interstate highway system and the expansion of electricity and phone networks. So the seeds for at least part of the growth in the 1960s were planted during the previous decade under Republican President Dwight Eisenhower. It also happens that from 1933 to 1968, there were 4 Democrats in the White House and only 1 Republican. That's important to note because the economy was a lot smaller back then, and it's easier to grow a small economy than a big one. When Roosevelt took office, GDP was just $57 billion. Today, it's $28 trillion. It's no wonder the economy grew by an average of 5.2% a year from 1933 to 1968. I'm not saying Roosevelt, Johnson, and Kennedy didn't do some great things.
So what are you saying?
They definitely did. But a lot of it was right place, right time. If you're wondering how Trump and Biden look on these measures, because we are talking about an upcoming election, the answer is they look roughly the same, despite what they may tell us.
We had the strongest economy that we've ever had by far, and all Biden did was pick up on it, but he ruined it.
My inherited economy is on the brink. Now our economy is literally the envy of the world.
The US has been in a period of slow growth since at least Obama's time, and that has continued into Trump and Biden's presidencies. The one exception is 2021, where the economy posted huge growth as it recovered from the shutdowns during the pandemic. Another example of right place, right time. But Biden does deserve credit for leading the charge on big stimulus packages that helped revive the economy.
Well, thank you.
In a 2014 study, economists at Princeton University looked at president's impact on the economy. They concluded, as I have, that it comes down to, in their words, mostly good luck with a touch of good policy. Of course, there are ways to size up presidents and the economy other than GDP. For example, C-SPAN's Presidential Historian Survey ranks presidents in a number of categories, including economic management. I was curious to see how historians' rankings line up with my GDP rankings. Interestingly, Lincoln and Washington rank 1 and 2 on their list of economic managers. That's hard to evaluate because who has data from 200 years ago?
Probably nobody.
But of the presidents I looked at, there wasn't much overlap between historians' rankings and my GDP rankings. Lyndon Johnson ranked second on GDP, but 18th according to historians. Harry Truman ranks dead last on GDP, but 8th according to historians. That could mean GDP is the wrong way to judge presidents. I think it shows that it's hard to judge presidents based on the economy, primarily because they have so little control over it. And that's a good thing. As we get deeper into the 2024 election, and voters try to decide if Biden or Trump will be better for the economy, remember to be grateful that we live in a country where no one has that much power, not even the president.